There is a sound the earth keeps secret, not the groan of tectonic plates pressing against one another in geological slow motion, not the distant rumble of underground aquifers moving through limestone passages carved over millennia, not the hum of geothermal vents releasing pressure built over centuries of subterranean heat. This sound is different. It is organised, it is periodic. It arrives on a schedule that has nothing to do with geology and everything to do with mathematics. And for decades, a small circle of government contractors, seismological analysts, and classified military researchers were aware of it and said nothing. Tonight, you're going to hear about Hollow Ridge. You're going to hear about a geophysical survey analyst named Dr. Elias Mercer, who received an assignment that most professionals in his field would have considered routine: archived seismic data from a remote mountain region, a closed site, a few anomalous readings that needed to be categorized, labeled, and filed away. Mercer did not file them away. Instead, he followed the data into government archives, into an abandoned monitoring facility, into a sealed listening station that had been quietly running its instruments for decades without anyone left to read the output. What he found inside that station does not fit neatly into any scientific category. It does not align with any natural phenomenon. And when he made the mistake of triggering the equipment, of allowing the old machines to do what they had been built to do, something deep beneath the earth noticed. You may want to keep the lights on tonight, or perhaps not. Perhaps darkness is more appropriate, because what lives beneath Hollow Ridge has never been afraid of the dark. It has simply been waiting for us to realise it was listening. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Survey. Dr. Elias Mercer was not the kind of man who looked for trouble. He was, by every professional measure, a careful man, methodical, trained in geophysical survey analysis at a mid-sized state university in the Pacific Northwest. He'd spent the better part of 15 years doing exactly what his title suggested: analysing, reading seismic data, interpreting waveform signatures, classifying underground vibration events into one of a handful of recognised categories: tectonic, volcanic, man-made, or atmospheric. He had never encountered a category labelled other, until Hollow Ridge. The assignment arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning in the form of a contract brief from a federal geological review board, one of several quasi-governmental agencies that periodically contracted independent analysts to review archived data from older survey sites. The brief was thin, only 12 pages, including a topographic overview, a timeline of data collection, and a summary note explaining that the recordings in question had never been fully analysed due to the abrupt closure of the relevant monitoring station in late 1993. The location was listed simply as Hollow Ridge Survey Zone Delta, situated in a remote mountainous region of the Pacific Inland Corridor. No county was specified, no GPS coordinates were provided in the brief. Just a file identification number, a crate reference, and a note indicating that the original recording tapes had been digitized and were available via secure transfer. Mercer requested the files, loaded them into his analysis software, and began working. The first thing he noticed was the sheer volume of data. Hollow Ridge had been monitored continuously from 1987 through 1993. 6 years of uninterrupted seismic recording across 14 sensor arrays positioned throughout the ridge system. That was not unusual in itself. Long-term seismic monitoring was standard practice in geologically active regions. What was unusual was the density of flagged events. In a typical 6-year monitoring period for a mountainous region of that type, a survey analyst might expect to find anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred flagged seismic events, moments when the sensor readings spiked beyond baseline and required human review. Minor earthquakes, settling events, occasional blast signatures from quarry operations in neighbouring regions. Hollow Ridge had 4,312 flagged events across its 6-year monitoring period. Mercer ran the figure again, then a third time. The number did not change. 4,312 separate moments in 6 years when the underground sensors at Hollow Ridge recorded something significant enough to trigger the monitoring system's alert protocol. That was an average of nearly 2 per day, every day for 6 years. No geological region produced that kind of consistent seismic activity without a known catalogued source. Not earthquakes, those clustered and receded. Not volcanic activity. Hollow Ridge sat nowhere near any recognised volcanic zone. Not mining operations. There were no permitted extraction sites within 40 miles of the survey area. Mercer pulled up the raw waveform data on the first flagged event, January 9th, 1987. At 14 minutes past 2 in the morning, the signal was clean, almost too clean. Where natural seismic events typically produce jagged, irregular waveforms reflecting the chaotic mechanics of geological stress release, this signal was smooth, rounded. It rose from baseline, peaked at a consistent amplitude, and descended again in a shape that, if you did not know what you were looking at, you might have described as graceful. Mercer knew what a seismic waveform was supposed to look like. This one looked like something else entirely. He began working through the flagged events chronologically, pulling up waveform after waveform, and within the first 40 files, he noticed a pattern that made the back of his neck prickle with something between excitement and unease. The signals were periodic. Not periodic in the way that tidal forces produce periodic stress on coastal geology. Not periodic in the way that seasonal freeze-thaw cycles create predictable settling patterns in mountainous terrain. This periodicity was precise, mathematical. The interval between flagged events did not vary randomly. It repeated, with a consistency that no natural geological process could account for. Mercer pulled up an astronomical almanac database and began cross-referencing the timestamps. The first flagged event, January 9th, 1987, coincided with the opposition of Jupiter, when the planet stood directly opposite the Sun as viewed from Earth. He almost dismissed the correlation as coincidence. Then he checked the next anomalous cluster, February 22nd of the same year. He checked the almanac, lunar perigee, the moment when the moon reached its closest orbital approach to Earth. He checked a third cluster, then a fourth, then 10 more. Every single cluster of flagged events at Hollow Ridge corresponded to a specific, identifiable astronomical event. Planetary oppositions, lunar cycles, solar maximums, perihelion, Earth's closest annual approach to the Sun, aphelion, the precise moments of the solstices. In 6 years of continuous monitoring, not a single cluster of anomalous seismic activity at Hollow Ridge had occurred outside of an astronomically significant window. Mercer sat back in his chair and stared at his screen for a very long time. Then he picked up the phone and began making calls. Chapter 2: The Impossible Pattern. The calls Mercer made in these first days after his initial analysis were careful, professional, deliberately neutral in tone. He reached out to colleagues at university geology departments, to former classmates now working in federal survey agencies, to a retired USGS analyst he had collaborated with years earlier on a Pacific Northwest monitoring project. He described what he'd found in general terms, an unusual degree of periodic seismic activity in an archived dataset, and asked whether anyone had encountered something similar. None of them had. Several offered explanations. Human-induced seismicity from unreported industrial operations, natural gas pocket dynamics in deep geological formations, deep focus micro-earthquakes, too small to register on surface networks, but detectable by localized sensors. Each explanation was plausible in isolation. None of them accounted for the astronomical periodicity. None of them explained why the signals appeared on schedule with the precision of a clock. Mercer went back to the waveform data. This time, he ran a spectral analysis, a process that breaks a complex waveform down into its component frequencies, the way a prism separates white light into a spectrum of individual colors. A natural seismic event, when subjected to spectral analysis, produces a broad, irregular spread of frequencies, noise across a wide band, with no particular order or hierarchy among the component signals. The Hollow Ridge waveforms produced something entirely different. When Mercer ran the spectral analysis on the first cluster of flagged events, he found himself looking at a frequency distribution that was not broad and irregular, but narrow and structured. The signal was not a smear of random frequency components. It was a stack of discrete, clearly separated frequency bands, each one sitting at a precise mathematical interval from the next. The intervals were harmonic. In music, a harmonic series is the sequence of frequencies that naturally arise when a fundamental tone is produced, each successive harmonic sitting at a whole number multiple of the fundamental frequency. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, or 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. The ratios are simple, clean, mathematical. They are the basis of musical scales, of resonant acoustics, of the physics of vibrating strings and columns of air. The Hollow Ridge signal was built on a harmonic series, a fundamental frequency deep in the infrasonic range, below the threshold of human hearing, with harmonics stacked above it at precise whole number multiples. Not approximate multiples, not near multiples, exact. No natural geological process produced harmonic infrasonic signals. Natural seismic events did not organize themselves into musical scales. Rock did not vibrate in harmonics. Underground pressure dynamics did not produce frequency ratios that were, to within the measurement precision of the recording equipment, mathematically perfect. Mercer sat with this finding for 3 days before he wrote it into his working notes. He ran the spectral analysis again on a different cluster. The same harmonic structure appeared. He ran it on every cluster he could access. The structure was consistent across all 6 years of data. The same fundamental frequency, the same harmonic ratios, a signal that had been broadcasting from beneath Hollow Ridge on an astronomical schedule in mathematically structured infrasonic harmonics for at least 6 years, and possibly much longer, given that the monitoring array had only been established in 1987. He went to the original survey documentation to see how the monitoring team had classified the anomalies. The official classification, stamped in red ink on a cover page attached to the digitized file, read, Subsurface atmospheric feedback, non-standard, class 4 anomaly. No further analysis required. Mercer stared at that classification for a long time. Subsurface atmospheric feedback was a real category in the survey taxonomy, a catch-all term for unusual seismic signatures that could theoretically be attributed to atmospheric pressure dynamics interacting with underground geological formations. It was a legitimate, if uncommon, classification. But it was also, in Mercer's professional experience, the kind of classification that got applied to things that survey teams could not explain and did not want to spend resources trying to understand. It was, in plain language, a placeholder. Someone had looked at 4,312 periodic, harmonically structured, astronomically synchronized underground signals and decided the most efficient course of action was to label them atmospheric feedback and close the file. Mercer requested access to the satellite imaging logs that had been archived alongside the seismic data. If the survey team had been running aerial or orbital observation of the Hollow Ridge region during the same period, those records might provide additional context for the underground anomalies. The satellite logs arrived 3 days later, and they contained something Mercer had not expected: GPS interference records. Every time a cluster of seismic anomalies had appeared in the ground sensor data, the GPS tracking systems covering the Hollow Ridge region had experienced temporary signal degradation. Not complete outages, just interference. A subtle but measurable disruption in the precision of GPS positioning data, covering a radius of approximately 8 miles centered on the survey zone. GPS interference originating from underground. Mercer was still processing the implications of this when the email arrived. It came from an anonymous address, a free webmail service, no identifying information attached, and it contained exactly 11 words. They were not detecting movement. They were listening. He read those words 3 times. Then he saved the email and began planning his travel. Chapter 3. Hollow Ridge Closure. The town nearest to Hollow Ridge Survey Zone Delta did not appear on most modern maps. It had been incorporated in the 1950s to support mining and logging operations in the surrounding mountain region, had grown to a population of just under 1,000 at its peak in the early 1970s, and had entered a gradual decline through the 80s as the extraction industries retreated. By 1993, it was the kind of place that people described, with no particular judgment, as a town that time had mostly forgotten. The survey station had been its last major employer. Mercer drove into the remnant of the town on a Wednesday afternoon in early autumn. The drive in from the highway took him through 40 minutes of 2-lane mountain road, through dense forest that pressed close on both sides, through elevation changes that made his ears pop twice. He passed no other traffic after the first 20 minutes. The town itself, what remained of it, was a main street of perhaps 8 blocks, maybe half of which were occupied, a diner, a small hardware store, a post office that appeared to operate on irregular hours, a gas station with a single working pump. The remainder of the storefronts were dark, their windows painted over or boarded, their signs faded to illegibility. The people who still lived there were, in Mercer's estimation, people who had simply never left, older mostly, settled into the particular stillness of communities that have given up expecting new arrivals. He ate dinner at the diner and began asking questions. He described himself accurately, a survey analyst reviewing historical geological data from the region, and asked, as casually as he could manage, whether anyone remembered the survey station that had operated up on the ridge. The response was not what he had expected. The diner's owner, a woman in her late 60s who had grown up in the town and had worked the counter there for over 30 years, set down the coffee pot she was holding and gave Mercer a look that was not quite wariness and not quite fear, but something adjacent to both. "Everyone up here remembers the survey station," she said. "What exactly are you looking for?" Mercer asked about the closure. about what had happened in 1993. The official record described a geological incident, a rockslide that had damaged the access road to the station and rendered the facility unsafe. The monitoring program had been suspended pending a safety assessment, and the assessment had apparently never been completed, leaving the station officially closed and access to the ridge area officially restricted. The woman behind the counter shook her head slowly when Mercer relayed this account. There was no rockslide, she said, or if there was, none of us saw it. What we saw was that 1 week the station was operating normally, and the next week there were men in vehicles we did not recognise driving up the mountain road. And then 3 days later, everyone who worked at the station had packed up and left. All at once, overnight practically. They came down the mountain and they drove away, and none of them ever came back. Mercer asked about the vehicles. She described them as dark-coloured, unmarked, not military surplus, newer than that, not government standard either, just dark and clean and bearing no identifiable markings. He asked if anyone else in the town might remember the period. Over the next 2 days, Mercer spoke with 14 residents of the town, ranging in age from 40 to 84. Their accounts, gathered independently, were consistent in ways that could not be attributed to collective misremembering. The animals had started behaving strangely in the months before the closure. Multiple residents mentioned it independently, without prompting. Dogs refusing to go near the forest line on the north side of town, the side that faced the ridge. Deer and elk, normally a common presence at the forest edge, disappearing entirely from the area around the base of the mountain. Birds going quiet in the trees nearest the ridge, in patterns that did not correspond to seasonal behaviour. A retired forest ranger named Dale Okonkwo, 72 years old, described spending 3 weeks trying to track a herd of elk that had inexplicably relocated from their established winter range on the lower ridge slopes. He had followed the tracks far enough to establish that the animals had moved steadily away from the mountain, not toward better grazing or water, but simply away, as if repelled. Several residents also described a sound, not a loud sound, not something you could point to and say there, "That is the sound I mean." More like a presence at the edge of hearing, a low, continuous vibration, felt as much as heard, arriving most strongly at night, when other ambient sounds fell away. Some described it as a hum, some as a drone. One elderly woman, a former schoolteacher named Marta Voss, described it as the sound the world makes when it is thinking about something. Mercer asked about the military helicopters. 3 separate residents confirmed them independently. Helicopters had made periodic visits to the ridge area throughout the late 1980s and into the early 90s. They came at night most often. They bore no visible markings. They did not land in the town or make contact with residents. They simply appeared above the tree line, moved toward the ridge, and eventually departed. One former mechanic, a man named Carl Hughes, who had worked at the gas station since 1981, remembered something specific about one of those visits. He had been working late, he said. It was summer, long twilight, and he had watched one of the helicopters hover above the ridge for what he estimated was close to an hour before it descended behind the tree line. When it rose again, approximately 40 minutes later, it was moving differently, slower, lower, as if it were carrying additional weight. Mercer filed that detail away carefully, but the most significant piece of information came not from a conversation, but from a cardboard box in the back room of the town's defunct historical society, a small, unlocked building that one of the residents had pointed him toward, with the comment that the historical society had closed 10 years ago. but nobody had ever gotten around to clearing it out. Inside the box, among yellowed newspaper clippings and community event programs, Mercer found a folder of photographs taken during the construction of the original survey station in 1986. The photographs showed the facility being built, concrete foundations being poured, prefabricated structures being assembled, support equipment being moved into position, and arranged around the perimeter of the facility, clearly visible in multiple photos taken from different angles, were the antenna arrays, not oriented toward the sky, pointed at the ground. Chapter 4. The Listening Facility. The access road to Hollow Ridge's survey, Zone Delta, had not been maintained in over 30 years. What remained of it was a rutted track through dense second-growth forest, barely wide enough for a single vehicle, blocked in 3 places by fallen trees that had to be climbed over on foot. Mercer had rented a truck with high clearance, parked it where the road became impassable, and walked the remaining 2 miles to the facility on a Thursday morning when the temperature was just above freezing and a light fog moved through the trees. He had a topographic map. He had the GPS coordinates he had finally managed to extract from a secondary archive file after considerable effort. He had a flashlight, a camera, a small digital audio recorder, and no clear legal authority to be there. The restriction on the area was administrative rather than criminal. Nobody had posted signs, nobody had fenced the perimeter, and the original survey documentation classified it as a suspended operation rather than a secure installation. He had decided after careful consideration that this ambiguity was sufficient. He found the facility at 11:42 in the morning. The surface structures had largely collapsed. Decades of snow load, frost heave, and simple rot had brought down most of the prefabricated buildings. What remained were concrete foundations, partially buried under leaf matter and encroaching vegetation, and the rusted frames of what had once been equipment racks, fencing supports, and antenna mounting structures. The downward-oriented antenna arrays he had seen in the photographs were gone, removed, he assumed, at the time of the closure. But as he picked his way through the collapsed structures, following the foundation lines, he found something the aerial photographs had not shown him. A hatch, set into a concrete pad that was mostly hidden beneath a collapsed prefab wall section. The hatch was heavy steel, approximately 1 meter square, secured with a locking mechanism that had long since corroded through. The lock had rusted to the point where the bolt no longer engaged its housing. Mercer pulled the handle, applied 30 seconds of steady upward pressure, and the hatch came free with a sound like a deep breath being released. Below was a steel ladder descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was cool and dry, unnaturally dry for an underground space that had been sealed for 30 years. Mercer stood at the top of that ladder for a long moment, listening. He heard nothing. Or rather, he heard something that was on the threshold of nothing, a vibration so low in frequency that it was more pressure than sound, a sense of the air itself carrying information he could not quite decode. He climbed down. The facility beneath Hollow Ridge was substantially larger than anything visible from the surface had suggested. The ladder descended approximately 8 meters into a reinforced concrete chamber that opened through a short corridor into a main monitoring room of perhaps 15 by 20 meters. The ceiling was low, just under 3 meters, and lined with cable management systems, most of which were still intact. Equipment racks stood in rows along 3 walls. A central cluster of workstations occupied the floor space between them. The emergency lighting was on. Not bright, a dim amber glow from battery-backed fixtures along the upper wall junctions, the kind of low-power emergency system designed to maintain minimum visibility in case of power failure. Mercer had expected total darkness. The fact that any power remained after 30 years was, by itself, striking enough to stop him in the middle of the main room and simply stand still for a moment. Then he noticed the equipment that was still running, not most of it. Most of the monitoring station systems were clearly dead. Screens blank, indicator lights dark, equipment cold to the touch. But in the far left corner of the main room, a bank of 3 analog recording units, large reel-to-reel machines of a type Mercer recognized from archival photographs but had never seen in operational context, were humming quietly, their reels turning at a slow, steady rate. Recording, still recording. Mercer approached the machines carefully. They were connected to a power conduit that ran along the floor and disappeared through a sealed penetration in the far wall, connected, he would later determine, to a small independent geothermal power tap that had been drawing energy from the thermal gradient of the rock formation itself. A passive system, one that required no maintenance, one that had been, apparently deliberately, designed to run indefinitely without human intervention. Someone had built a monitoring facility beneath Hollow Ridge with the specific intention that it would continue to operate after the human staff had left. He examined the recording machines. They were archival grade units, the kind used for long-term data capture rather than real-time monitoring. The tape reels were enormous, each one capable of recording at extremely slow speeds for extended periods. He could not immediately determine how much of the archive was stored on physical tape versus what had been transferred to other media, but the sheer number of tape reels stacked on the storage shelves along the back wall suggested that the system had been accumulating recordings for years. He found the playback controls. He found an output connection. He connected his digital recorder and began listening. At standard playback speed, the recordings were nearly inaudible, a faint hiss of infrasonic energy that registered more as a physical sensation than a sound. His recorder's meter showed signal, but his ears could barely detect it. He slowed the playback down, first to half speed, then to 1/4, then to 1/8. As the playback slowed, the signal became audible, then distinct, then unmistakably structured. He was listening to a repeating transmission, not music, not language, at least not any language built on phonemes or syllables, or any of the organizational principles of human speech, but organized nonetheless, layered. A fundamental tone cycling through a repeating sequence, with harmonics stacked above it that shifted in relationship to one another, according to a pattern that, as Mercer listened, he could feel himself beginning to track, to anticipate, as if some part of his mind was already learning to expect what came next. The mathematical ratios were there. The same harmonic structure he had identified in the spectral analysis of the waveform data upstairs, but here, slowed to audible frequencies, they formed something that the human ear could engage with, could almost, if you listened long enough, begin to interpret. He sat on the floor of the underground facility at Hollow Ridge and listened for 4 hours. He missed nothing that happened in those 4 hours, not a single moment of it. He listened with the total, absorbed attention of someone hearing something for the first time that they have been, without knowing it, waiting their entire life to hear. Chapter 5. The reply. The facility's archive contained more than recordings. In a fireproof filing cabinet bolted to the wall adjacent to the recording station, Mercer found the operational logs of the Hollow Ridge monitoring program. Handwritten entries in bound notebooks, filed chronologically, covering the full 6 years, from 1987 through 1993, 42 notebooks in total. He photographed every page. The early notebooks, the first 2 years of the program, were largely technical. Sensor calibration records, equipment maintenance logs, data quality assessments. The tone was that of professional researchers performing a methodical job. Whatever they were looking for, or whatever they had been assigned to look for, they had not yet found anything that disturbed them. The third notebook, dated to early 1989, contained the first entry that suggested the researchers had begun to understand the nature of what they were monitoring. The entry, written in a careful, precise hand that appeared throughout the later notebooks, read in part, "Signal coherence has reached a level that we can no longer attribute to natural harmonic resonance in the geological substrate. The mathematical structure is consistent. The periodicity is consistent. We are not measuring a geological phenomenon. We are receiving a transmission." Several entries later, a different hand, larger, less careful, had added a single underlined word beside this assessment: confirmed. The notebooks from 1990 through the early months of 92 documented the monitoring team's increasingly systematic analysis of the transmission. They had, it appeared, access to computational resources that allowed them to perform analyses considerably more sophisticated than Mercer's own initial spectral work. They had identified additional layers of structure in the signal beyond the basic harmonic series, nested patterns, sequences that repeated at different time scales, what one entry described as something resembling a carrier signal with embedded data packets. They had also, at some point in early 1991, made a decision. They transmitted a reply. The notebook entry describing this decision was brief. "We have received authorization to proceed with a response protocol. The response will mirror the transmission's harmonic structure at equivalent amplitude, broadcast downward through the antenna array. Duration, 6 hours. Objectives, confirm receipt, establish bidirectional communication baseline, assess response." The entry had been written in the careful, precise hand. The next entry, written 48 hours later, was in a different hand entirely. The handwriting was unsteady. The letters were larger than they should have been for the size of the notebook's ruled lines, as if the writer's hand had not been entirely under control. "Something responded," it read. "Different frequency. Signal has modulated. We are beginning analysis." From that point, the tone of the notebooks changed completely. The clinical precision of the early records gave way to something that Mercer could only describe. Reading through the photographed pages that night, in his truck on the mountain access road, as escalating distress. The entries became shorter, more fragmented. The careful hand that had dominated the first years of the logs appeared only intermittently, and when it did, the normally precise writing showed signs of agitation. Pressed harder into the page, letters formed with less control, margins abandoned. The content of those later entries was more disturbing still. 11 days after the initial reply, the monitoring team began reporting physical anomalies in the facility. Vibrations that registered on no seismometer but were felt by everyone in the underground space. Not tremors, there was no lateral movement, no structural impact. Just a deep, pervasive resonance that the team described as feeling like standing inside a bell that had just been struck. Electronic equipment had begun behaving erratically, recording systems switching themselves to playback mode without input. Communication equipment activating and transmitting on frequencies the team had not dialed. Environmental controls cycling through states that the control panel did not reflect. 3 weeks after the initial reply, The notebooks began documenting something that Mercer read and reread multiple times, unsure how to categorize it. The team was dreaming the same dreams. Not the same themes or emotional textures, the same specific content, the same architectural spaces, descriptions of vast geometric chambers, structures of a scale that suggested interior dimensions measured in kilometers rather than meters, corridors that curved in ways inconsistent with conventional architectural geometry, surfaces that reflected light in patterns that the dreaming researchers could describe in extraordinary detail when they woke, and that, when they compared notes each morning, matched one another with a precision that excluded the possibility of coincidence. The monitoring team leader, the author of the careful, precise hand, wrote an entry in the 31st notebook that Mercer photographed and sat with for a long time in the cold of his parked truck. We are not certain whether we are dreaming about something that exists or whether something is showing us what it wants us to see. The distinction may not matter. What matters is that the content of these shared experiences has been consistent for 19 consecutive nights. Whatever is below us has found a way to communicate that does not require our equipment. It is using our own minds as receivers. 2 entries later, a final line in that same careful hand. It changed frequency after we answered. Chapter 6. Contact Event. Mercer spent the night in the underground facility. He had not planned to. The plan, such as it had been, was to document what he found, photograph everything, collect audio recordings, and return to his vehicle before dark. Plans had a way of restructuring themselves when the situation they were designed for turned out to be different from what had been anticipated. The situation at Hollow Ridge was different from what had been anticipated. He set up his equipment in the main monitoring room, the digital audio recorder, his laptop, a small electromagnetic field detector he carried as a standard piece of field kit, and 3 additional recording devices he had packed almost as an afterthought. He began a systematic documentation of the facility, working through each equipment bank in turn, photographing, cataloguing, taking field notes. It was during this documentation, sometime around 9 in the evening, by his watch, that he accidentally triggered the main power relay. He was examining a control panel in the back section of the facility, following the cable routing to understand what each system connected to, when his elbow made contact with a large toggle switch that had been left in the armed position. The facility, running on its geothermal tap, was carrying live current through that switch. When he bumped it, it connected. The effect was immediate. Every equipment rack in the facility came alive simultaneously. Screens that had been dark for 30 years lit up with amber and green indicator lights. Fans that had not spun in decades began cycling up to operating speed. The 3 analog recording units, already running, increased their real speed to what Mercer recognized as their active monitoring rate. And from somewhere deep in the concrete substrate of the facility, from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling, from everywhere at once and from no specific point, a resonance began. He felt it before he heard it. A pressure in his chest, a sense of his own body's natural vibration patterns being overlaid by something external, something that arrived not through the air, but through the solid matter surrounding him. The concrete, the steel, the rock behind the concrete. Something was transmitting through the geological medium itself, and the facility, now fully powered, was receiving it. His electromagnetic field detector, which he had set on a flat surface near the central workstation cluster, began showing readings that went off its operational scale. The scale topped out at a measurement that would ordinarily represent a significant industrial electromagnetic source. The detector's display simply maxed out and held there, all indicators pegged to maximum. His digital audio recorder was running. The laptop was running. All three of his backup recording devices were running. Later, when he reviewed the recordings, he would spend considerable time trying to determine whether what they had captured was a real electromagnetic phenomenon or an artifact of the facility's sudden power-up interfering with his equipment's calibration. He would never reach a definitive conclusion on that question. But what the recordings showed, regardless of interpretation, was this: the electromagnetic pulses being emitted from somewhere beneath the facility floor were forming visual patterns. His laptop's screen capture software, running passively in the background, had been triggered by the electromagnetic interference and had captured the display during the event. On the screen, visible as clearly as any intentional display, were geometric shapes, not random configurations of static or interference bands, forms, structured, repeated, organized forms that appeared to cycle through a sequence. Mercer reviewed those screen captures later and described them in the notes he made that night as follows: nested geometric structures, recursive symmetry, each form containing within it a smaller version of itself, containing within that a still smaller version, and so on, to a depth that exceeded the resolution of the display. The progression of forms through the sequence suggested either a message being composed one component at a time, or a mind introducing itself incrementally, beginning with the simplest element of its structure and building toward complexity. But the most significant observation Mercer recorded from that night was not the visual patterns, it was this: while the resonance was at its peak, while the facility's systems were running at full power and the electromagnetic pulses were rolling through the underground space in measurable waves, Mercer's own brainwave patterns were being affected. He knew this not from any medical device. He had no EEG equipment in his field kit, but from the subjective experience of it. He recorded, simultaneously aware of his own thoughts in their normal form and aware of something layered beneath them, a secondary structure, an architecture of association and connection that was not his own, but that had been somehow made accessible to his perceptual awareness. He described it inadequately as feeling like a room that had always existed beneath the room he normally lived in, now briefly illuminated. And in that illuminated space, he wrote, there was no malice, no threat, no predatory intention of any kind. What he perceived was attention, pure, sustained, patient attention. The attention of something that had been present for an immeasurably long time and had, at last, found a way to make contact with a kind of mind that lived on the surface of the planet above it. The entity beneath Hollow Ridge, Mercer wrote that night, with his hands shaking enough to make the handwriting unsteady, is not studying the Earth, it is studying us. Chapter 7. The Underground Presence. Mercer came up from the facility at dawn. He had stayed the full night, not entirely by choice, but because the power-up event had disoriented him thoroughly enough that navigating 2 miles of unmaintained forest track in darkness had seemed inadvisable. He had slept for perhaps 3 hours on the floor of the monitoring room, wrapped in the emergency blanket from his field pack, with the facility's systems running around him and the low resonance continuing at a level he had eventually ceased to consciously perceive. The way one eventually ceases to consciously perceive the hum of an air conditioning unit in a room where one has spent enough time. He drove back to the town. He ate breakfast at the diner. He ordered more coffee than was probably reasonable and spread his laptop and notebooks across the counter and worked for 7 hours. What he was working on was a geological model. The survey archive he had accessed before leaving his office had included not just seismic waveform data, but geological scan records, deep penetration, acoustic imaging results that mapped the subsurface structure of the Hollow Ridge Formation to depths of several kilometers. These records had been filed with the broader survey archive and had, like everything else in the collection, been labelled with the same non-analytical classification and set aside. Mercer was not setting them aside. He ran the acoustic imaging data through a 3-dimensional modelling program he used in his standard analytical work. The process was computationally intensive and took the better part of 3 hours on his laptop. But when it finished, he had a rendered model of the geological structure beneath Hollow Ridge. At a depth of approximately 3.2 kilometers below the ridge's surface, the model showed a void. Not a geological void in the conventional sense, not a cavern, not a lava tube, not a subsidence feature. Those structures had recognizable signatures in acoustic imaging data. They appeared as negative spaces bounded by natural geological formations, with irregular edges and shapes determined by the fracture patterns and material properties of the surrounding rock. This void had smooth walls. The acoustic imaging showed a chamber, and chamber was the right word, Mercer decided, because what the data depicted was clearly an enclosed space with a defined interior of approximately 1.8 kilometers in its longest dimension and roughly 600 meters at its widest. The walls were not only smooth but uniformly curved in a geometry that his modelling software flagged as architecturally significant. An ovoid form, elongated on one axis, with internal surface curvature that was mathematically consistent throughout. Natural geology did not produce uniform curvature. Natural geology produced fractures and faces and the irregular planes of mineral crystallization. What Mercer's model showed was a space that had been shaped. He ran a geological age estimation on the surrounding rock formations, a standard analytical tool that used the known deposition and formation rates of the identified mineral matrices to estimate when the surrounding geological structure had achieved its current form. The surrounding rock was old, very old. The formation rate has indicated that the geological matrix encasing the void had reached its current state approximately 240 million years ago. Whatever occupied the space at 3.2 kilometers beneath Hollow Ridge had been there, by geological measure, since before the age of dinosaurs. Mercer found this number difficult to hold in his mind in a productive way. 240 million years was not a number that human cognition was built to process on an intuitive level. He tried various analogies. If the entirety of recorded human history was compressed to a single day, 240 million years was approximately 15,000 years of those same days. If you drove at highway speed continuously, it would take more than 2,000 years to accumulate 240 million miles. The number remained, despite these efforts, essentially incomprehensible. He worked through the theoretical implications methodically, in the way that his training had taught him to approach anomalous data, not by reaching for the most dramatic interpretation, but by ruling out alternatives systematically. Could the void be a natural geological formation that happened to have smooth walls? The modelling data said no. The curvature was too consistent, the geometry too regular. Could the void be man-made? No. No human engineering technology had ever been capable of creating a smooth-walled chamber at 3 kilometers depth, let alone doing so 240 million years ago. Could the geological age estimation be wrong? Possibly, with significant error margins. But even correcting aggressively for error, the surrounding rock matrix was old in a way that excluded any human origin for the structure. What remained after eliminating the alternatives was the hypothesis that something had created the void at Hollow Ridge before the first dinosaur walked the Earth. Something that possessed, at minimum, the capability to shape geological formations at depth. Something that had been present beneath this specific location for longer than vertebrate life had existed on land. And something that, in the past 30 years, had begun communicating with the creatures living on the surface above it. Or rather, and this was the refinement that Mercer added to his working notes late that afternoon, something that had always been communicating, had always been transmitting its periodic, harmonically structured signals on an astronomical schedule, and had simply been waiting for the surface creatures to develop the instrumentation capable of receiving those signals. The monitoring station at Hollow Ridge had not found something new. It had found something ancient that had been there all along. And when the monitoring team had replied, when they had transmitted signals back down into the geological medium, whatever lived in the smooth-walled chamber 3 kilometers below had noticed, had responded, had, in the language available to it, introduced itself. Chapter 8. Government Retrieval. The vehicles arrived on the morning of his 3rd day in the town. Mercer was at the diner again. It had become his working base, the counterwoman having accepted his presence with a pragmatic tolerance that extended to keeping his coffee cup filled without being asked. When he saw them pull into the main street, 3 SUVs, dark-coloured, late model, no identifying markings, moving in the coordinated spacing of a convoy rather than 3 vehicles that happened to be travelling in the same direction at the same time. They parked outside the diner. 4 people got out, 2 men and 2 women, all in civilian clothes, all carrying themselves with the particular economical precision of people who had received similar physical training. One of them held a tablet that Mercer recognised from the angle at which it was being referenced as displaying a photograph of his face. He did not run. He had no particular interest in running. He had, in his experience, no legal obligation to do so, and he was curious in the specific way that people who have just spent 2 days confronting extraordinary information become curious about the organisational infrastructure that had previously surrounded that information. The lead person, one of the women mid-40s with an expression that combined professional courtesy with the complete absence of emotional engagement, sat down across from him at the counter and introduced herself by a first name only. She asked if he had visited the Ridge survey area. He confirmed that he had. She asked what he had found. He described, in general terms, the facility and its contents, the running recording systems, the operational logs, the power relay activation and its consequences. Her expression changed very slightly when he mentioned the relay. Not in a way that most people would have noticed, but Mercer was watching carefully, and he noticed. He was asked to surrender all recording devices, storage media, and physical documentation collected at the site. He complied with this request after a brief and entirely civil discussion about the legal parameters of the situation, during which it became evident that the individuals asking had the practical capacity to compel compliance through means that Mercer preferred not to necessitate. He surrendered the devices. He did not mention the encrypted backup that had been uploading to a remote server continuously since he had first arrived at the facility. He spent approximately 4 hours in the back of one of the SUVs parked on the main street of the town, answering questions from a rotation of the 4 people who had arrived. The questions were methodical and comprehensive. They were clearly working from an established interview protocol, the kind developed for situations that had occurred before, that had organisational procedures attached to them. This had happened before. Near the end of the 4 hours, one of the agents, a man younger than the others, who had been mostly silent throughout the questioning period, stepped out of the vehicle with Mercer for what he described as a short break. They stood in the cold air on the main street, and the man looked at Mercer with an expression that was doing something more complicated than the professional neutrality the team had maintained throughout the questioning. "We stopped responding decades ago," the man said. "The program was closed because the decision was made that continuation was not in the interest of the project. You understand what I mean by that?" Mercer said he thought he did. The man looked at the mountain, visible above the tree line in the middle distance. "When you activated that relay," he said, "you transmitted. The equipment transmitted. And whatever protocols are running down there, whatever the system defaults to when it receives an unscheduled signal, we have no way of knowing what those are. We haven't known for 30 years. He paused. "You woke it back up," he said. "Whatever you found when you activated that relay, that's what it looks like when it wakes up." Then he went back inside the vehicle, and they released Mercer an hour later with a document he was asked to sign that he described, in his subsequent notes, as a confidentiality agreement that was carefully worded to acknowledge nothing specifically while prohibiting discussion of everything generally. He signed it. Then he drove 40 miles to a gas station with Wi-Fi and checked his remote server backup. Everything was there. Chapter 9. The After Effects. The first thing Mercer noticed in the weeks after Hollow Ridge was the sound. Not the transmission he had recorded, not the slowed-down playback of the facility's archived recordings, a different sound, or rather, a different presence at the edge of sound. The same quality he had noticed in the moments before he descended the facility ladder. Low, below the threshold of ordinary hearing, felt more than perceived, but constant now, in a way it had not been before. He had it assessed. He saw an audiologist describe the symptom carefully in terms that did not include Hollow Ridge, and submitted to a thorough evaluation. His hearing was normal. His inner ear showed no pathology. The audiologist suggested tinnitus, a possibility Mercer did not dismiss, but did not find entirely convincing either, given the specific quality of what he was experiencing. Tinnitus was, in his experience of reading about it, typically described as a ringing or buzzing. This was neither. This was a presence, a resonance, something that, if you tried to listen to it directly, retreated to below the threshold of direct attention, but that was unmistakably there when you were not specifically listening for it. The second thing he noticed was the electronics. His devices, laptop, phone, a small tablet he used for reading, began experiencing interference events. Brief, precisely timed. Not random glitches of the kind that any electronic device experiences over time. These occurred at intervals. He began timing them with the methodical habit of a data analyst who understood that intervals contained information. The intervals were familiar. They corresponded with a precision that he verified against astronomical almanac data 3 separate times to the same event windows that had characterized the anomalous seismic activity at Hollow Ridge. Planetary oppositions, lunar cycles, solstice moments. His electronic devices were glitching, briefly and precisely, every time an astronomically significant event occurred. He contacted 3 colleagues in different parts of the country, careful contacts, people whose professional discretion he trusted, and described the interference pattern in neutral terms, asking whether they had observed anything similar in their own equipment. He did not share the astronomical correlation. He simply described the symptom and asked. 2 of the 3 reported similar patterns. Then the reports began coming in from the independent research community. Mercer had not, at this point, released any of his Hollow Ridge recordings or documentation, but the information infrastructure of independent geological and geophysical research was broad enough, and its practitioners networked enough, that anomalies did not remain isolated for long. Reports of unusual underground seismic signatures, periodic, harmonically structured, astronomically correlated, began appearing in online discussion spaces that Mercer monitored as a professional practice, not from one location, from many. The reports came from monitoring enthusiasts and amateur seismologists across 4 continents. The signals they described varied in their surface characteristics, different fundamental frequencies, different harmonic ratios, different amplitudes detectable by the low-grade equipment available to independent monitors. But the core pattern, periodic, structured, astronomically synchronized, was consistent across reports from locations separated by thousands of kilometers. Hollow Ridge was not unique. There were others. Mercer mapped every independently reported signal location he could find. He cross-referenced the geographical distribution with geological data, looking for common features among the sites, common rock types, common depth to bedrock profiles, common proximity to geological formation types that might explain why signals were appearing in those specific locations. No common geological feature explained the distribution. The signals were distributed across geological formations as varied as the Earth's surface offered. Granite uplands, sedimentary basin floors, volcanic plateau regions, ancient shield terrains. The rock beneath each site was different. The geological history of each site was different. The one thing the sites had in common was that each one was located at a significant distance from major urban centres. Isolated, quiet, places where underground signals could persist for decades without being registered by the dense seismic monitoring networks concentrated around cities and populated regions. Places where something could be present, broadcasting, transmitting for a very long time without anyone in the noise of modern civilization noticing. Mercer added each new site to his map. The pattern of dots across the Earth's surface was not random. He ran a spatial analysis. The sites were distributed with a regularity that, when mapped, suggested a global network. Not a network in the sense of a communication system connecting separate elements. A network in the sense of a single, distributed structure with multiple surface-accessible nodes. He sat with his map for a long time. Then he opened his laptop and began preparing the recordings. Chapter 10. The Final Transmission. He released the first fragment on an unremarkable Thursday afternoon, not through any major platform, through a modest personal website, a simple page with minimal formatting, a brief explanatory text that described the recordings as material of unknown origin gathered at an unspecified location and subjected to standard analytical processes. He linked to the spectral analysis data. He linked to the acoustic imaging model. He linked to photographs of the facility's interior and to transcribed excerpts from the operational logs, stripped of all identifying geographic information. He did not claim to know what he had found. He presented the data and invited analysis. The response was gradual at first, a few dozen people accessing the page in the first day, drawn through links in the independent research communities where Mercer had been watching the distributed signal reports accumulate. Then a few hundred. Then, as the material was shared and discussed and linked from other platforms, a few thousand. The people who found the recordings and stayed with them, who downloaded the full data archives, who ran their own spectral analyses, who spent hours with the slowed down audio, were the kind of people who had been for years watching independent seismic monitoring data with the specific hope of finding exactly this kind of pattern. They went to work. The analysis that emerged from the distributed research community over the following 3 weeks was more comprehensive than anything Mercer could have accomplished alone. Dozens of people with varied technical backgrounds, signal processing specialists, amateur radio operators familiar with modulation schemes, mathematicians with interest in pattern recognition, acousticians, linguists who specialized in pattern analysis rather than human language, all contributed to a collective examination of the Hollow Ridge recordings. The finding that emerged from this collective examination was significant. Embedded within the repeating transmission, within the harmonic structure that Mercer had identified in his initial analysis, was a coordinate system. Not coordinates in any format derived from human mapping conventions, not latitude and longitude, not any derivative of those systems. A coordinate system that appeared to be self-referential, that described positions relative to other positions within the same signal, creating a map that was not of a surface, but of a network. When the researchers plotted the coordinate relationships against a globe, the positions that emerged matched with unsettling precision the locations of the independently reported underground signal sites. The transmission from Hollow Ridge contained a map of all the other transmitters, and the transmission had been continuously broadcasting this map on its astronomical schedule, in its mathematically perfect harmonic frequencies, for at least 6 years of monitored operation and an unknown period before that. The signals were growing stronger. Mercer documented this in the final weeks before he recorded his last entry. Not stronger in the sense of louder or more energetic, stronger in the sense of more coherent. The harmonic structure of the signals being reported by independent monitors worldwide was becoming more organized, more precisely structured, more internally consistent than it had been in the earliest reported observations, as if the distributed network were synchronizing, as if the separate nodes of the global system were, over these weeks and months, bringing themselves into alignment. Into what kind of alignment and toward what purpose? These were questions Mercer spent considerable time with, in the manner of someone who understands that the questions are important and that the answers are likely beyond what any individual mind can confidently provide. He made his final recording on a cold evening in late autumn, in his home office, surrounded by monitors displaying seismic data feeds from independent stations across 4 continents. He spoke directly into the camera. 6 months ago, he said, I received an assignment to review archived seismic data from a closed survey site. The data was anomalous. I followed it. What I found at Hollow Ridge, and what I have found in the months since, does not reduce to a simple conclusion. I am not going to tell you what to believe. I am going to tell you what I have observed. He listed his observations carefully in the precise language of someone trained to distinguish between what data shows and what interpretation suggests. He described the transmission, the facility, the logs, the contact event, the distributed reports, the coordinate map, the synchronization. Then he paused. The signal has shifted again, he said. Over the past 14 days, the fundamental frequency of the transmissions being recorded at sites worldwide has changed. Not by much, a small but measurable modulation. And the modulation follows a pattern I have seen before. It is the same type of modulation that the Hollow Ridge logs documented in the days after the monitoring team transmitted their first reply. He looked at the camera for a moment without speaking. When the monitoring team replied to the Hollow Ridge transmission in 1991, he said, "The transmission changed frequency." The logs described the change as the entity responding to contact, shifting its signal in ways that suggested it was engaging with the reply, processing it, adjusting its output accordingly. The global signal has just made the same kind of shift. He looked down at his notes, then back at the camera. "I do not know what triggered it. I have not transmitted anything. The independent monitoring community has not, to my knowledge, transmitted anything. But something somewhere has initiated contact on a scale that the Hollow Ridge team in 1991 did not approach. And whatever lies in the network of chambers beneath the surface of this planet has noticed." He reached toward the camera. "The signal has shifted," he said. "For 2 years of documented monitoring, the transmission has sounded like a question, a pattern presented and repeated, a fundamental frequency broadcast alongside a harmonic structure that functions as best as I and the people I have been working with can interpret it, as an invitation, a signal organized in a way that a sufficiently advanced receiver could decode, structured to say, 'Here is what I am. Here is where I am. Here is how to speak with me.'" He paused again. The monitor behind him scrolled through a spectrum analysis display, waves moving across the screen in smooth, organized patterns that bore no resemblance to the jagged noise of natural seismic data. "It no longer sounds like a question," he said. "It sounds like synchronization." He reached forward and ended the recording. Epilogue. What the ground remembers. There is a discipline within geology called paleogeophysics, the study of how the Earth's physical properties have changed over geological time. Its practitioners work with rock samples and magnetic signatures and isotope ratios to reconstruct conditions on Earth that existed before any observer was present to record them. It is, in its way, a form of archaeology, an excavation not of human artifacts, but of planetary history. One of the things that paleogeophysics has established with reasonable confidence is that the Earth has been through transitions of extraordinary scale, periods when the atmosphere was entirely different from what it is now, periods when the distribution of land and water bore no resemblance to current geography, periods when the organisms living on the surface were so different from anything alive today that they might as well have inhabited a different planet. What paleogeophysics cannot tell us, what no discipline currently can tell us, is whether, in any of those previous configurations of the Earth, there was something present that observed them, something with the longevity to have watched the planet's surface change through dozens of mass extinctions and geological upheavals, something with the patience to have been present through the emergence and development of every significant form of life the planet has hosted. 240 million years is a long time to wait, but if you are patient enough, if the time scales of your existence are measured not in years or centuries, but in geological epochs, then 240 million years might be approximately how long it takes for the life forms on a planet's surface to develop the technological capability to receive your transmissions. And if that is the case, If you have been broadcasting on your astronomical schedule, in your mathematically perfect harmonics, across your global network of deep Earth transmitters, for as long as it has taken the surface species to develop ears capable of hearing you, then the first moment of contact is not a surprise. It is the culmination of a plan formed before those surface creatures had yet stood upright. Elias Mercer does not sleep well anymore. This is not, he is careful to note, necessarily a bad thing. The low resonance that he still perceives at the edge of hearing has qualities that he has spent considerable time trying to characterize accurately, and one of those qualities is that it is not unpleasant. It is not the sound of threat or danger. It is, as near as he can describe it, the sound of attention, of being perceived, of existing within the awareness of something that is aware of you in the way that you are, only now beginning to be aware of it. He monitors the global signal reports every morning. The synchronization continues. The signals grow more coherent with each passing week, more precisely organized, more internally consistent, more clearly intentional in their structure. The coordinate map embedded in the transmissions has been verified by independent researchers at 17 separate sites. The astronomical correlation has been confirmed by amateur seismologists on 5 continents. The harmonic structure has been analysed by signal processing specialists who have independently reached the same conclusion that Mercer reached in his initial spectral analysis. This is not noise. This is not geology. This is communication. What it is communicating, what the full content of the transmission is, beneath the layers that current human analytical capability can decode, remains unknown. What the synchronization is building toward remains unknown. Whether the entity or entities responsible for the global transmission network have intentions that align with human flourishing, or are simply indifferent to it, or operate on scales of consideration so vast that the concept of intention does not meaningfully apply, all of this remains unknown. What is known is this: something has been present beneath the surface of this planet for longer than humanity has existed. Something organized enough to have built a global network of deep Earth transmission facilities, something patient enough to have broadcast for 240 million years, something attentive enough to have noticed the moment when the creatures on the surface above it developed the technology to receive, however imperfectly, the signals it was sending, and something responsive enough to have shifted its frequency globally, simultaneously, in a coordinated modulation across every node of its worldwide network, in the weeks after the first serious analysis of its transmissions was published online. It's been aware of us for longer than we have been aware of ourselves. We did not find it in space. We did not detect it from a radio telescope array pointed at the stars. We did not receive a signal from a distant solar system and spend decades developing the capability to reply. It was here. It has always been here. And now, for the first time in 240 million years, it has changed its signal. Not because of what we sent it, because of what we finally heard. There is a particular kind of silence that has nothing to do with the absence of sound. Anyone who has spent time in a rural place, really spent time there, sleeping with windows open, waking before the birds, understands what I mean. True silence is never really quiet. There are crickets. There are frogs cycling through their endless negotiations with the dark. There is the ambient hiss of wind through tall grass, the distant complaint of a car moving somewhere on a road you cannot see. There is always something. Even at 3 a.m. in the middle of nowhere, the world is never fully still. That is how you know when something is wrong. Not by the presence of a strange sound, but by the total, impossible erasure of all the sounds that are supposed to be there. Caleb Mercer was 51 years old in the autumn of 2018. He had lived his entire life within a 12-mile radius of the land his grandfather had first cleared and planted in the 1930s. He had watched his father age and fade in the same farmhouse where he had been born, had inherited not just the acreage and the equipment and the debt, but the particular way of moving through the world that comes from generations of people who have worked the same ground. He was not a mystical man. He was not interested in ghost stories or conspiracy theories or the kinds of things that people discuss in online forums late at night. He drank his coffee black. He kept his accounts in a paper ledger. He went to bed early and rose before the sun and measured the success of a day by the concrete, tangible progress of work completed. The orchard sat on a broad, gentle slope east of the Wenatchee River in central Washington state, in a valley that the Cascade Range cups on 3 sides like a hand sheltering a flame. The Columbia Basin stretches out to the east, high desert country, and the transition between those two landscapes, the wet, forested mountains to the west and the dry, open plains to the east, happens precisely in this valley, which is why the apple industry took root here generations ago. The combination of warm days and cold nights, the volcanic soil, the controlled irrigation, it produces some of the finest fruit in the world. And the growers who work this land have a quiet, undemonstrative pride in that fact that they would never state aloud. Caleb had walked these rows since he could walk at all. He knew each tree the way a shepherd knows each animal. He knew the ones that were slow to blossom and the ones that overproduce and strip themselves of fruit before it can ripen. He knew the topography of the land beneath the trees, where the drainage slows and where it runs fast, where the soil holds heat and where it goes cold early in the season. He knew this land the way you can only know something you have dedicated your life to. The night of September 14th, 2018, began as an ordinary night by every possible measure. The harvest season was well underway. Caleb had been on the property since before sunrise, working with the small crew he employed through the picking months. And by 9 in the evening, he was in the farmhouse, eating a late dinner alone, his boots still on, tired in the clean and honest way that comes from physical labour sustained over a long day. The television was on in the other room. He couldn't have told you what was playing. It was just noise and light in the background, the modern equivalent of leaving a candle burning. He was planning to be in bed by 10:30. He had no reason to think that night would be different from any other. There was no premonition, no unease, no sense of something coming. He has said this many times since, to the various people who have asked him to recount the events. He felt nothing. And then the lights went out. It happened all at once, not the gradual flicker of a circuit tripping somewhere in the house, but a simultaneous extinction of every powered thing on the property. The television, the refrigerator, the outdoor security lights he kept running on a timer, the digital clock on the microwave, the router, all of it gone in the same instant. The farmhouse filled with a darkness that felt immediately total and complete. The kind of dark that takes your eyes a moment to accept because it seems at first like a condition of your vision rather than of the world outside you. Caleb sat at the table for a few seconds, waiting for the generator to kick on. He had a backup system for exactly this kind of situation. A habit inherited from his father, who had lost a refrigerator full of produce to a summer outage and never forgot it, but the generator did not start. He checked his phone. 11:42 in the evening. He had a signal barely, the way you always barely have a signal out there. He tried calling the power company's outage line and got a busy signal. He put the phone in his pocket and went to find a flashlight. He remembers pausing at the back door of the farmhouse before going outside. He remembers putting his hand on the doorknob and just standing there for a moment, though he cannot say why. There was no conscious reason for the pause. He opened the door and stepped out into the yard. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the silence of a quiet night. He knew that silence, not the reduced background noise of a rural area unpopulated by traffic. This was something else. This was the silence of a space that has been evacuated of everything that usually fills it. The crickets were gone. Not diminished, not unusually quiet, gone all at once as if something had reached into the dark and switched them off. The same way the power had been switched off. The frogs along the irrigation ditch that ran along the south edge of the property. Gone. The distant sound of trucks on the state route 2 miles east. Gone. Even the wind, which had been blowing steadily from the northwest all day, had stopped. Not faded, stopped. The air was absolutely motionless. Caleb stood in his yard in the dark with a flashlight he hadn't turned on yet, and became aware of his own breathing the way you become aware of it in a medical setting. When someone is monitoring you, and suddenly the sound of your own lungs seems loud and strange and biological. He stood there long enough for his eyes to adjust. The sky was clear, and the stars were sharp above him. The Milky Way doing its tilted sweep across the darkness, the way it does out there where there is very little light pollution. He has said that he was looking at the sky almost immediately, though he could not explain why. Some instinct drew his gaze upward, and that is when he saw it, just above the canopy of the orchard, which was to the north of the farmhouse, the rows running east-west up the slope. There was a light. He has struggled for years to describe it accurately, to resist the temptation to reach for familiar language that doesn't quite fit. It was pale, almost white, but with a quality that he sometimes describes as internal, as if it was not reflecting light from somewhere else, but generating its own illumination the way a lantern does, from within. It was not spherical. This is something he always emphasizes, aware that the cultural image of a UFO is circular, a saucer, a disc. This was rectangular, or nearly rectangular. The edges were not crisp the way the edges of a manufactured object are crisp. They were slightly blurred, slightly uncertain, the way an image appears when a lens is not quite in focus, or the way a reflection shimmers at the margins when water is disturbed. It was approximately, and he uses this word carefully, aware of the imprecision, approximately the size and shape of a large window, or perhaps a section of wall. He estimates it was hovering perhaps 30 feet above the top of the tallest apple trees, which would put it perhaps 50 or 60 feet above the ground. It made no sound. In that absolute silence, it hung there, emitting its pale, uncertain light, and Caleb Mercer stood in his yard and looked at it with a particular frozen quality of a person whose brain has received information it does not yet have a category for. He counted the seconds. He has said this many times, that some automatic part of him began counting the moment He registered what he was seeing, as if he already knew that the duration was going to matter, was going to be something people would ask him about. He counted to 47, and then the light bent. That is the only word he has ever found for it. It did not move in the sense of travelling from one point to another along a visible path. It did not accelerate or streak. It bent, the same way a beam of light bends when it passes through a prism, but in reverse, as if the light itself was folding upward, curving into a dimension adjacent to the one Caleb was standing in. And then it was gone. Not gone in the sense of being switched off, but gone in the sense of being elsewhere, of having departed through some exit that did not correspond to any direction Caleb could name. And in the same instant, not a second after, not in the gradual way that systems restarted, the power came back on. Every light, every appliance, the refrigerator hummed, the television resumed whatever it had been showing. The generator, which had never engaged, sat silent and unnecessary in its shed. And then, as if cued by the return of electricity, the crickets resumed. All at once, not building back gradually the way they do after a car passes and startles them into silence. All at once, at full volume, as if they had simply been waiting for a signal. Caleb stood in the yard for several more minutes. He turned on his flashlight and walked to the edge of the orchard and shone it up into the trees, but there was nothing to see. He went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and sat there for a while. He did not sleep well that night. In the morning he went into the orchard at first light. The anomaly was in the northernmost section of the orchard, in the block of trees his grandfather had planted first. The oldest trees on the property, their trunks thick and gnarled and grey. In the middle of this block there was a circle. He estimated its diameter at 30 feet, though he would later measure it more carefully and find it was slightly larger than that, closer to 32 feet across. Within this circle, every apple on every tree had fallen. Not some of them, all of them. They lay on the ground in an undisturbed carpet, and what struck Caleb immediately was that they were not damaged in the way that fruit is damaged when it falls naturally. When an apple falls from a tree, it bruises on impact. The skin breaks on one side, the flesh beneath darkens and begins to soften within hours. These apples looked as if they had been gently placed on the ground. Their skins were intact, their colour was correct. They looked, he said, like a still life, like something arranged by a careful hand. The leaves within the circle were wrong, not burned, not scorched in the obvious way you might expect if something hot had passed over them. They were desiccated, the word he uses, though it took him a few days to land on the right term. Dried out, the way a leaf looks in late October when the season is fully done, when the tree has called back all the chlorophyll and the tissue has given up its moisture. But this was September. The trees outside the circle were still fully green and laden with fruit. The trees inside the circle had leaves that crumbled when he touched them, that released a fine dry powder when he ran his hand along a branch. The bark of the trees inside the circle was unchanged. The root systems, as far as he could tell, were unchanged. Only the leaves and the fruit had been affected, and only within the precise boundary of the circle. He got a thermometer from the house, the kind you push into soil to check temperature for planting, and took readings inside the circle and outside it. The ground outside the circle, in full morning shadow, read at about 58 degrees. The ground at the centre of the circle read at 69 degrees, 11 degrees warmer in the middle of the night, under a sky that had been clear and cold. He took multiple readings to be sure. The heat was real and consistent. His neighbour to the east, a man named Dougherty, who worked in construction, had a Geiger counter he he used when his crew did demolition work in older buildings where asbestos and other materials sometimes turned up unexpectedly. Caleb asked to borrow it that morning, giving some vague explanation about wanting to check something, and spent an hour moving through the orchard with it. Outside the affected circle, the readings were what he expected: background radiation, the normal ambient count that exists everywhere on Earth. Inside the circle, particularly at the centre, the counter clicked at a rate noticeably above baseline. Not dramatically so. He was not looking at a contaminated site, not at levels that would register as dangerous, but distinctly, measurably elevated in a way that should not have been possible on an apple farm in central Washington. He took photographs of everything. He took photographs of the fallen fruit and the desiccated leaves and the ring where the affected area met the normal area. The boundary was remarkably clean, he noted, more like a line drawn with a compass than the ragged edge you'd expect from any natural process. He took photographs of the soil readings on his thermometer. He photographed the trees inside the circle from multiple angles. He did not know quite what he was documenting or why, only that some instinct told him to document it, that whatever had happened here was not going to be easy to explain, and that evidence, visible and tangible evidence, was going to matter. He called nobody that day. He went back and forth about calling the county extension office, which handles agricultural anomalies and disease outbreaks and that kind of thing, but he hesitated. He was not sure how to describe what he'd seen the night before, without sounding like someone whose account should not be taken seriously. He was a third-generation farmer with a reputation in the valley. He had relationships with suppliers and distributors that depended on being perceived as a stable and rational person. He did not want to be the man who called the county extension office and said there had been lights above his orchard, and now there was a circle in his trees, so he waited. That same morning, on the other side of the ridge that separated his property from the Halloran dairy farm, 3 cows had spent the night standing motionless in the paddock nearest Caleb's orchard. Tom Halloran, who was 63 and had been milking since he was a teenager, said he had never seen anything like it. Not cows standing still, which was unremarkable, but the particular quality of their stillness, the angle of their bodies, all 3 facing in the same direction, facing the ridge, their eyes open and fixed, not moving for the entirety of the night, as far as Tom could tell from the motion-sensitive cameras he kept in the paddock. They were normal in the morning. They ate normally and gave normal milk yields. But one of the calves born the following day, in what appeared to be a completely normal birth, had an unusual membrane condition in its eyes, a translucent secondary membrane that partially occluded vision in both eyes. The attending veterinarian had no diagnosis for it. She had not seen it in cattle. She sent photographs to colleagues at the State Agricultural School and received no answer that satisfied her. Toxin exposure was ruled out. The calf was otherwise healthy. The membrane condition resolved on its own within 3 weeks, and the calf grew normally. But Tom Halloran did not forget it. Caleb checked his phone that evening for the first time since the outage. The smartwatch he wore, a basic fitness tracker, nothing sophisticated, logged his movement data automatically. And when he pulled up the previous night's log, he sat with the phone in his hand for a long time before he understood what he was seeing. The movement log showed normal activity throughout the day, the accumulated steps and elevation changes of a working day in the orchard. In the evening, it showed him sitting, the reduced activity of a person at rest. And then, at 11:42 in the evening, the log simply stopped. Not as if he had gone to bed and the tracker had registered sleep. The data just ceased, as if He had ceased to exist for the purposes of the device. The next entry in the log was at 12:16 in the morning, 34 minutes of no data at all. He looked at the phone timestamp. He remembered stepping outside during the outage. He remembered seeing the light. He remembered counting to 47. He remembered going back inside and sitting at the table. In his memory, the entire experience outside lasted no more than 5 or 6 minutes, certainly not 34. He was absolutely certain of this. He is the kind of man who is rarely uncertain about time, who has spent decades waking before alarms and knowing intuitively how much day is left. He did not believe he had been outside for 34 minutes. He had no memory of the intervening time. He had no sense of time having passed. He checked the camera footage from the security system. He ran on the farmhouse and outbuildings and found that the cameras had been offline from 11:42 to 12:16 as well, consistent with the power outage. But the outage was not supposed to have lasted that long. The power had come back on the instant the light vanished, and he was certain the light had lasted less than a minute. He has never been able to resolve this discrepancy. There is no version of the timeline he has been able to construct that makes the numbers add up. 34 minutes is missing from the record of that night in a way that cannot be explained by sensor malfunction or software error or any of the prosaic explanations he has tried to apply to it over the years. In the week that followed, Caleb's sleep was disrupted in a way that he found deeply uncomfortable to discuss, because the experience did not feel like a nightmare in the conventional sense. He was not afraid while it was happening. There was no terror, no chase, no sense of threat. What he experienced each night, on multiple occasions between sleep and full waking, was a recurring image of a corridor that had no walls. Not the absence of walls in the sense of an open space, but a corridor whose walls existed as a kind of suggestion, as a structural logic, rather than a physical boundary. He could see the shape of a passage without seeing what the passage was made of, and within this corridor, standing in arrangements that he describes as geometrically precise, were figures. Not figures that he could describe with any confidence. He could not tell you their height or their number with certainty, only that they were present, and that their arrangement in space relative to each other was exact in a way that felt mathematical. And there was a tone, not a sound exactly, or not only a sound, a vibration that he felt in his chest, in his sternum and his ribs, the way you feel the bass from a speaker that is tuned very low. He would wake from these episodes with a nosebleed on 3 separate occasions. He woke each time with a metallic taste in his mouth, the taste of old coins or a bitten lip, and on the 4th morning, when he was washing his face, he found a rash behind his left ear. 3 small marks arranged in a triangle, slightly raised, slightly warm to the touch. He photographed it. The rash faded within a week and did not return. He went to see his doctor about the nosebleeds and the metallic taste. He did not mention the lights or the orchard. He told the doctor he had been under stress and was sleeping poorly. His doctor ordered some blood work. The results came back, and his doctor called him to discuss them. 2 findings were anomalous. His iron levels were elevated significantly above his normal baseline. His doctor had his records going back 15 years, and this was a notable change, unexplained by any dietary shift Caleb could identify. And there were protein markers in his blood that his doctor had not seen before, that did not correspond to any known pathogen or autoimmune marker. His doctor suggested the lab might have made an error, which happens, and recommended they redraw the sample. The 2nd sample was lost in transit to the lab. By the time the 3rd sample was taken and analysed, several weeks later, the anomalous markers were gone. The local Facebook group for the Wenatchee Valley area, a community group with a few thousand members, mostly farmers and tradespeople and people who had grown up in the area, had been quietly accumulating posts about the night of September 14th. Caleb found them by accident, searching for information about the power outage, which he had assumed would have generated some official notice from the power company. He found the notice. The power company had attributed the outage to a transformer issue on a rural feeder line, but he also found a thread of comments underneath someone's post about the outage that had grown to nearly 80 replies. People had seen lights, multiple people, independently, without coordination. A woman in her car on the highway east of town who had pulled over when her engine began stalling. A couple who had been sitting on their porch 2 miles to the north and had watched something they described as a bright rectangle moving very slowly, and then not moving, and then being gone. A retired man who did amateur radio work from a workshop behind his house and had noticed his compass spinning erratically for several minutes during the outage window. A retired electrical engineer who lived on the north end of the valley had not seen any lights, but had been awake because of the outage. He used medical equipment that required power and had been monitoring his backup battery system. He had logging equipment running as part of his home setup, and when he reviewed the logs the following morning, he found something he posted about at length and with some technical specificity. During the period of the outage, his equipment had registered an electromagnetic surge, a sudden massive increase in electromagnetic field strength, followed by an equally sudden cessation. He described it in his post as consistent with what you would expect from the operation of an extremely powerful electromagnet, or from what he called, with obvious care for his credibility, a high-energy field compression event. He noted that the characteristics were unlike anything he had seen in 40 years of professional experience with electrical systems. He noted that the field seemed to be moving, that its signature changed in a way that suggested a source that was not stationary. He posted his data. Several people commented skeptically. He did not respond to the skeptics. He posted the data and stepped away from the conversation. The county sheriff's office sent a deputy out to Caleb's property 4 days after the incident, following a complaint from a neighbour, not about lights or anomalies, but about the circle of damaged trees, which was visible from the road and had prompted a call to the county extension office from someone who was worried about a new fungal blight. The deputy was a practical man named Vasquez, who had been in law enforcement for 22 years and was not interested in conspiracy theories. He looked at the circle. He looked at the soil temperature readings Caleb showed him. He listened while Caleb, choosing his words carefully, described what he had seen on the night of the 14th. Deputy Vasquez wrote down some notes. He took photographs of the affected area. He said the county would look into it. He attributed the power outage to the transformer issue the power company had cited. He suggested the circle might be the result of soil contamination, some old buried material that was off-gassing, which can happen in areas with agricultural history. He was not unkind. He was simply a man doing his job in the way that his job had trained him to do it. 2 days after Deputy Vasquez's visit, Caleb noticed the SUVs. There were 2 of them, parked on the ridge road that ran along the northern boundary of the property, a dirt track that accessed a cellular tower and was not typically used by anyone except the occasional hiker or a county worker doing maintenance. The SUVs were dark-coloured. He initially thought black, but later decided they might have been dark grey or dark green, and they had no identifying marks that he could see from the distance he was at, which was perhaps 300 yards. There were men with equipment near the affected circle. He walked toward them. By the time he reached the edge of his own property, they were gone. He found disturbances in the soil at the centre of the circle that were consistent with soil sampling, narrow core holes in a pattern that suggested a methodical survey. Someone had been on his land without his knowledge or permission and had taken soil samples from the precise centre of the anomaly. He did not know who they were. He was not able to find any official record of a visit from any state or federal agency. He asked Deputy Vasquez, who said he had no knowledge of any survey. He asked the county extension office. He asked the power company. Nobody claimed the visitors. The security camera system Caleb ran on the property was a consumer-grade setup, the kind you can buy at a hardware store. 8 cameras, a central recording unit, the footage stored on a hard drive inside the farmhouse. The cameras had been offline during the outage, as he had already established. But the hard drive had been running before the outage began, and when he recovered footage from the previous week, he found something that had escaped his initial review. One of the cameras, positioned on the north side of the equipment barn facing the orchard, had captured the earliest moments of the event. The footage degraded rapidly as it approached 11:42, and the image from that period was heavily corrupted, horizontal lines breaking the frame into sections, the image stuttering and doubling on itself. But there were individual frames that were cleaner than others, and Caleb spent several evenings working through the corrupted footage manually, frame by frame, trying to extract anything intelligible. What he found in the cleaner frames did not look like what he had expected. He had expected to see the pale rectangular glow he had seen with his own eyes, a solid luminous shape above the tree line. What the camera showed was different. The object, the shape, the light, whatever it was, appeared to be layered in a way that the naked eye had not conveyed, as if it had depth, or as if it was composed of multiple translucent planes stacked on top of each other, each plane slightly offset from the others, each one carrying a portion of the total luminosity. And the interior geometry of those layers was not static. In frames taken fractions of a second apart, the internal structure appeared to have shifted. Lines and angles that were present in one frame were absent in the next and replaced by different lines and angles, as if the object's interior was in constant motion, as if what you were looking at was not a solid thing, but a process, an ongoing event. He could not make any definitive claim from corrupted footage. He was aware of that. But what he saw in those frames was not consistent with any aircraft or atmospheric phenomenon he had encountered in a lifetime of living beneath these skies. And then in one frame, a single frame badly corrupted at the edges but clear enough at the centre, there was a beam, narrow, pale, descending from the underside of the layered shape into the centre of the orchard, vertical, straight. It was there for one frame and gone in the next. He does not know what to make of it. He has never known what to make of it. A ham radio operator named Gerald Fenn, who lived 40 miles to the east in the high desert country beyond the Columbia, was awake on the night of September 14th because he was almost always awake late. He was a retired school teacher with insomnia who had been a radio hobbyist for most of his adult life. He routinely logged anomalous signals, the kind of atmospheric and ionospheric events that ham operators sometimes catch by accident, and he filed his logs with a small private network of enthusiasts who shared a database. He had caught something on that night that he flagged immediately and posted about in the network the following morning. A low-frequency signal below the range of normal human hearing that had been pulsing at irregular but structured intervals. He had analysed the pulse sequence and found that the intervals between pulses corresponded to prime numbers 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13 in sequence repeating. He noted that the signal appeared to originate from the west, from the direction of the Cascades. He had, of course, no way to know that 40 miles away, in a river valley apple orchard, a man had just witnessed something strange. The two men did not connect until months later, brought together by a researcher who had found both their accounts independently. Audio enhancement software applied to the corrupted camera footage revealed a low-frequency signature in the audio track that was consistent with what Fenn had logged. The same pulse pattern, the same frequency range. Caleb had been standing in his yard during this. His chest had been vibrating. He had felt it and registered it and filed it away as part of the general strangeness of the experience, not knowing that he was standing inside a signal that someone 40 miles away was recording. The physical changes that followed in the weeks after the event were subtle enough that Caleb initially dismissed them, or tried to. He noticed, in the way you notice things when you're paying attention to yourself in a new and uncomfortable way, that his night vision had improved. Not dramatically. He was not seeing in the dark in any cinematic sense, but the adjustment time when he moved from a lit interior to a dark exterior was shorter than it had been, and he could make out details in low-light conditions that had previously been invisible to him. He noticed that sounds seemed sharper. He could hear conversations from distances that he would not previously have been able to. He noticed, and this one troubled him the most, because it was the hardest to ascribe to physiology, that he occasionally seemed to know things before they happened. Not with any dramatic specificity, not in the way a prophet knows things. Small things. He would pick up the phone 30 seconds before it rang, knowing that it would ring. He would turn toward a doorway 20 seconds before someone walked through it. He would pull his truck to the side of the road before he had consciously registered that there was something in the road ahead. These episodes happened consistently enough over a period of several weeks that he could no longer dismiss them as coincidence. They were not dramatic. They were not exciting. They were unsettling in the way that a malfunction in a reliable system is unsettling, because they represented his own perceptions behaving in ways he could not account for. His doctor, reviewing the blood work at the follow-up appointment, agreed that the anomalous protein markers were probably a lab error, given that the redrawn sample showed nothing unusual. He did not disagree with his doctor. He did not tell his doctor about the predictive episodes. He drove home and went back to work. 3 weeks after the initial incident, on the 3rd of October, the silence returned. He recognized it instantly. The same total, complete, architectural silence that had preceded the first event. He was in the farmhouse, and he became aware of it in the way you become aware of a sound stopping, because the ambient noise of the night had been present, and then it was not. And the transition was so abrupt that it registered as a physical event. He went to the window and looked toward the orchard and saw nothing. He waited. He put on his coat. He went outside. This time, there was no power loss. The farmhouse light stayed on behind him. The security cameras, he confirmed later, ran continuously through the entire event. And the light, when it appeared closer. Not above the tree line, but above the barn, which was 40 yards closer to the farmhouse than the northern orchard block where the circle had formed. It was the same pale, internally luminous quality, the same slightly blurred edges, the same rectangular shape. But this time, Caleb was not frozen. He had had 3 weeks to process the initial experience, or to begin processing it. And when the light appeared, he stood and looked at it with a quality of attention that was deliberate rather than paralyzed. He watched it for perhaps 2 minutes, and in that time, the light did something it had not done in his first sighting. It changed. Not in its external dimensions. The rectangle remained approximately the same size and shape, but in its apparent depth, it unfolded. He uses this word consistently, and with some frustration because he knows it is not adequate, but no other word has served him better. The object, the shape, the phenomenon seemed to acquire dimensions that it had not previously appeared to have. It went from looking like a flat, luminous panel to looking like a room. Not a room of any recognizable architecture, but a space with depth, a space with an interior. And through the interior, he could see something. He saw an orchard. Not his orchard, as it was in October of 2018. Not the living trees with their harvest season fullness. What he saw through the interior of the light was an orchard that appeared to be his orchard. He recognized the slope of the land, the spacing of the rows, the relative positions of the equipment barn and the farmhouse, everything oriented in the way that was as familiar to him as his own face, but abandoned. The trees were overgrown in the way that happens when an orchard is left unmanaged for many years. The canopy had spread and thickened, and where adjacent trees had once been pruned to maintain separation, they had now grown into each other, their branches interlocked into a continuous dense mass. The ground between the rows, which he kept cleared to manage pests and maintain access, was deep in unmowed grass and volunteer brush. There was no equipment visible, no sign of habitation. The farmhouse, or what he could see of the farmhouse through the limited aperture of the light, was dark and appeared to be in a state of disrepair. And the sky above this other orchard was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the wrong colour. It was not a red sky or an alien sky in any obvious sense, but it was darker. Darker than it should have been at any time of night that corresponded to what he was experiencing. The stars, what he could see of them through the light, were arranged correctly. He was certain of that. He knew these stars. But the sky itself seemed to absorb light differently, to hold it less, as if the atmosphere above this other orchard were thinner or differently constituted. He looked at it for what felt like a long time, and then the light folded back. That same reversal of the unfolding, collapsing its apparent depth back into flatness, and bent upward and was gone. He went inside and sat at the kitchen table, and did not sleep. It took him several weeks to arrive at a framework that felt adequate to what he had experienced, and even now he holds this framework loosely, aware that it is the best he has been able to do rather than a settled conclusion. He had spent those weeks reading, not in any organised or expert way, but the way a person reads when they're trying to find language for something unprecedented, pulling at whatever threads seem related, following them wherever they lead. He read about dimensional theory. He read about multiverse hypotheses in physics. He read about documented anomalies in other agricultural areas. He read about electromagnetic fields and their relationship to biological tissue. He read about the history of UAP reports, unidentified aerial phenomena, the term that had replaced the older acronym in official contexts, and was struck by how consistently the agricultural and rural cases differed from the more famous cases. The famous cases tended toward the dramatic, intercepts, military footage, air traffic anomalies. The rural cases tended toward the quiet and the strange and the biological. Circles in fields, animal behaviour changes, missing time, physical effects on plant material, the soil anomalies. He found documentation of similar events in Idaho farmland, in the high desert of eastern Oregon, in the agricultural plains of Saskatchewan. Not widely separated in time, not coincidences if you believed in the pattern. A pattern of something moving through or over agricultural land, leaving specific and consistent traces in a corridor that ran roughly north to south through the interior west. The object, he concluded, and he acknowledged that concluded was perhaps too strong a word, that hypothesized was more honest, was not an aircraft. It was not a craft in any sense that implied travel from one point to another through continuous space. What he had seen through the interior of the light on the night of October 3rd was a different place, not a distant place, not a place that was far away in any navigable direction, a place that occupied the same coordinates as his orchard, but existed in a different state, a different version of the same location. The circle of fallen fruit and desiccated leaves was not damage caused by the passage of a vehicle or the discharge of an energy weapon. It was the ground-level signature of a brief partial overlap between two versions of the same place, two environments occupying the same coordinates simultaneously for a period of 47 seconds. The heat, the radiation, the electromagnetic surge. These were the friction of that overlap, the evidence of two realities pressing against each other in the same space. He is not a physicist. He does not claim any technical authority for this interpretation, but it is the interpretation that accounts for the most evidence while requiring the fewest unsupported assumptions, and he has held it for several years now without finding anything that directly contradicts it. The SUVs came back in early November. This time, one of the men approached him directly. He was standing in the orchard near the circle. The radiation had faded by this point. The thermometer was reading normal temperatures. The circle was still visible only because the desiccated leaves had not recovered and the trees within it had not re-leafed. When a man came across his property without announcing himself and introduced himself only as Mr. Hale. Mr. Hale was perhaps 50, perhaps older, with the manner of someone who has spent a long time being careful about what he reveals. He did not offer a card. He did not show identification. He asked in a conversational way that was clearly not casual whether Caleb remembered the events of September 14th clearly. Caleb said he did. Mr. Hale asked whether he had seen through it, whether he had seen what was on the other side. Caleb, who by this point had decided that honesty in the absence of other information was probably the safest strategy, said yes. Mr. Hale nodded, as if this confirmed something. He said that this part of the country had a history, that it wasn't the first event in the region and probably wouldn't be the last. He mentioned, with the careful specificity of someone who has rehearsed what they are willing to say, that similar events had been documented in agricultural land in Idaho and in the eastern Oregon desert and in the Canadian plains north of the border. He implied, and this is Caleb's interpretation, he acknowledges he may have read this in, that these events were being monitored, that the monitoring had been going on for some time, and that the agency or organisation doing the monitoring was not the one whose name was on any building Caleb would recognise. Then Mr. Hale asked whether Caleb intended to be on the property on the next new moon. Caleb asked why. Mr. Hale said that based on the interval pattern in the documented events from the region, an additional event at this location was probable within the next 30 days. He said this with the tone of a meteorologist discussing an 80% chance of rain. And then he left, walking back across the property to the Ridge Road, and the SUVs drove away, and Caleb never saw Mr. Hale again. The next new moon fell on a Thursday in mid-November. Caleb was in the orchard. The silence came at 11 in the evening. He was ready for it, or as ready as you can be for something like this. He had a camera, he had a voice recorder, he had a notebook and a pen. He had a chair because the previous events had involved standing, and he had decided that if there was going to be another one, he was going to face it seated, which felt, in some way he could not fully explain, like a deliberate choice, rather than a reactive one. He sat in the chair at the edge of the affected area and waited. The light appeared at 11:22. It appeared directly above the circle, not above the tree line as it had the first time, not above the barn as it had the second time, but directly over the ground at the centre of the circle, lower than he had seen it before. He estimated it was perhaps 20 feet above his head, close enough that he could feel something, not heat, not the warmth he would have expected from an object that had left the ground 11 degrees warmer. Something more like pressure, like the air was being asked to do something it was not designed to do. He had decided during the weeks of thinking and reading and sitting with everything that he was going to walk into the circle if the opportunity presented itself. He cannot fully explain this decision. He does not present it as an act of courage, because he does not think courage was what it required. It was more like something being resolved, a question that had been sitting unanswered in him since September 14th that he had determined to answer if the chance came. The chance came. He stood up from his chair and he walked into the centre of the circle, and he stood there. He did not disappear. He was not taken anywhere. He did not lose consciousness. What happened was subtler than any of those things, and in some ways more disorienting, because it happened to his perception rather than to his location. He became aware, standing inside the circle beneath the light, of a doubling. Not of vision exactly, and not of sound, more fundamental than either of those. A doubling of place. He was standing in his orchard in November in central Washington state, his feet in the cold soil, the stars clear above the light that hung overhead. And simultaneously, with equal immediacy and equal clarity, he was standing in the other orchard, the abandoned one, the overgrown one. Both were real, both were present. Not one layered over the other in the way that a double exposure lays two images over each other, but both simultaneously, equally, fully there. He stood in both orchards at the same time, and he looked around. The future orchard, he has always called it that, the future orchard, though he acknowledges he has no proof it was the future, only a sense he could not shake, was not desolate in the way that abandoned places are often desolate. It was not melancholy, it was still. The trees were massive, having grown for what looked like decades without management. The grass was tall, the farmhouse was dark, its windows empty, but it was standing. The sky above it was the darker sky he had seen through the light on October 3rd, the sky that held less light, and when he looked up at it he saw something he had not expected. The sky was not empty. Across its surface, at a height that was impossible to gauge, not close, not low, but visible, there were geometric patterns. Faint, luminous, arranged in a grid that covered the entire visible sky. Not bright enough to constitute illumination, not shapes that cast any shadow on the ground below them, but present, undeniably present, like the ghost of a structure that had been suspended in the upper atmosphere and had gradually become part of the sky itself. There were figures in this orchard. He saw them at a distance. He could not specify the distance. The visual logic of this space did not correspond to the visual logic he was accustomed to. Distances seemed to compress and expand in ways that made accurate estimation impossible. They were standing among the trees. He could not tell you their number with confidence. He could not tell you their height. He could tell you that they were oriented toward him, that whatever their eyes were, if they had eyes in any conventional sense, were directed at him. And he could tell you that there was nothing in their orientation toward him that felt like threat. He has spent a long time with this assessment, and he returns to it consistently. They were not threatening. They were not welcoming in any way that implied emotional warmth. They were observational. He was the subject of a quality of attention that was patient and complete, and devoid of the kind of intent that would produce either fear or comfort. One of the figures communicated with him. He does not describe this as speech because there were no words in any sense he can identify, no sounds, no syntax, no language. What he received was something closer to a meaning delivered directly, without the vehicle of language. A single meaning, clear and complete. 4 words, more or less, though he acknowledges the reduction to language loses something in the translation. We are not arriving. We are aligning. And then he was standing in his orchard, alone. His orchard in November. The single orchard, the real orchard. The light was gone. The silence held for another few seconds and then broke. The crickets, the distant highway, the wind through the rose, and he was alone in the dark in his own land, breathing. He sat back down in the chair and sat there for a very long time. The radiation faded completely over the following 2 weeks. The soil temperature inside the circle returned to normal. The trees within the circle, the ones whose leaves had desiccated, recovered. By the following spring, they were indistinguishable from the trees outside the circle. The fallen fruit from that first morning had been cleared away. The predictive episodes stopped. His blood returned, on the next workup, to entirely normal parameters. The altered sensory experience, the sharpened night vision, the heightened hearing, faded gradually over a period of months until they were gone. The orchard returned to what it had always been. Caleb returned to the work of running it. He did not speak publicly about what had happened for almost 2 years, and when he eventually did speak, in a carefully written account posted to a private research network, not in a television interview, not in the kind of forum that would have attracted ridicule. He did so with a specificity and a restraint that researchers who reviewed his account found notable. He made no claims beyond what he had directly experienced. He offered his photographs, his thermometer readings, his blood test records, his smartwatch data, the enhanced audio from the camera footage, and the testimony of his neighbours. He offered the framework he had constructed, the overlay hypothesis, the overlap of locations rather than the visitation of beings, not as a conclusion, but as the most internally consistent interpretation he had been able to reach. He invited correction. He received some. He incorporated what was useful and set aside what was not and went on. Each year, on the 14th of September, he is in the orchard at 11:42 in the evening. He has not missed it once, not the first year after the incident, not in the years that have followed. He brings the voice recorder, he brings the thermometer, he sits in the same chair at the edge of the same circle, which is invisible now in the healed ground, but whose exact centre he has marked with a buried stone. And each year, at 11:42, the silence comes. Not the light has not returned. Not the electromagnetic anomaly, not the falling apples or the desiccated leaves or the heat in the soil, only the silence. The total, complete, architectural silence that has nothing to do with the absence of sound. It lasts exactly 47 seconds. He counts every time. He has never miscounted. And then the crickets come back, and the frogs, and the distant highway, and the wind through the rose, and the night resumes its ordinary business. He has no explanation for this annual silence. It does not produce any measurable physical effects. It leaves no trace. It is simply there and then not there, a gap in the world's ambient noise that corresponds precisely in its duration to the 47 seconds he counted on the first night, watching the pale rectangular light above his trees. He does not know what it means. He does not know if it means anything, but he notes it carefully in the log he has kept since 2018. This man who measures the success of a day by the concrete and tangible progress of work completed. And he sits with it the way you sit with something that is beyond your ability to resolve. And he goes back inside when it's done. In the agricultural plains of Saskatchewan, 340 miles north of the Montana border, a wheat farmer named Annette Brewer documented a circle event in the summer of 2016. In the high desert outside Burns, Oregon, a rancher named Tate Erickson reported missing time and anomalous soil readings in the spring of 2017. In the Snake River Valley in southern Idaho, multiple landowners in the same watershed reported simultaneous animal behavior anomalies and power outages on a single night in the autumn of 2019. The electromagnetic signatures, documented in each case where they were documented at all, fell within the same frequency range. The soil temperature anomalies fell within the same temperature band. The animal behavior changes followed the same pattern, and in each case, in the aftermath, the land returned to normal. The crops grew, the animals calmed, the radiation faded, and the people who had experienced what they experienced went back to their work, because the work does not pause for the inexplicable, because land requires attention regardless of what has passed above it, or through it, or alongside it. Whatever is moving through this corridor, north to south, or south to north, the directionality is not clear. Whatever is overlapping with these landscapes, these agricultural places with their specific soils and their specific electromagnetic properties and their specific relationship to water and light, it is not announcing itself. It is not leaving calling cards in any language we have learned to read. Mr. Hale implied that it had been happening for longer than any of the documented cases, that the monitoring predated the current generation of satellites and sensors, that what was being observed had been observed through older means by different agencies across a span of time that Caleb did not press him to specify. Whether that is true, and whether Mr. Hale was who he appeared to be, or something other than what he appeared to be, is not something Caleb can determine. He noted what the man said and filed it where he files things he cannot verify. We are not arriving, we are aligning. 4 words more or less. A meaning delivered without language, received by a man standing in 2 places at once, in 2 versions of the same orchard, one living and one abandoned, under 2 skies, one familiar and one mapped with geometric grids he could not name. A message that raises more questions than it answers, as all real messages do. What are they aligning? For what purpose? On what timeline? Toward what end? In the absence of answers, Caleb Mercer keeps his accounts in his paper ledger. He tends his trees. He is outside on the 14th of September every year, in the dark, in the cold, counting the seconds of a silence that belongs to something he cannot name. And whatever that something is, it keeps coming back. Not to his land, not anymore, not physically, not in any way that leaves a trace, but to the coordinates, to the place in space where his orchard and the other orchard, briefly, impossibly, occupied the same ground. The coordinates, apparently, have been noted. Something is checking them, every year, right on time.